3 o'clock in the morning. The Atlantic did not offer a greeting. It offered a wall of freezing spray that hit the face like needles. Carlos shoved the wooden boat into the dark, churning surf, his boots sinking into the wet sand with every step. The wood groaned against the friction of the tide. He climbed in, gripped the oars, and began the pull. His palms met the familiar, worn surface of the wood, a texture carved by decades of repetitive motion. The village behind him remained dark, a silent cluster of houses lost to sleep, leaving him entirely alone against the black expanse of the water. He cast the nets. They hit the surface with a heavy, wet slap, sinking into the void. He waited. The ocean offered nothing but the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull and the biting wind that worked its way into his skin. He pulled the ropes, checking for the slight, vital tension that signaled a catch. The nets came up empty, dripping brine back into the dark. He reset, cast again, and pulled. This was the rhythm of his life. No witnesses, no relief. Just the ocean, the weight of the nets, and the relentless, crushing isolation of a man who worked while the rest of the world dreamed. The ocean rarely gave back what he put in. By the time he dragged the boat back onto the sand, his palms were mapped with raw, open lacerations. He sat on the threshold of his shack, breathing in the smell of salt and drying rot, and methodically wrapped his hands in strips of frayed fabric. The sting was constant, a reminder of the physical cost of his existence. He stood, his lower back locking in a sharp, familiar protest, and crossed the room. He knelt, fingers digging into a loose gap in the floorboards. He pried the wood upward, revealing a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside, the pages were dense with ink. He did not record memories. He recorded market prices, the fluctuations of fuel costs, and the logistics of supply chains. While his body suffered the labor of the nets, his mind was busy constructing a map out of the poverty that held him. He held the pencil, his bandaged fingers gripping it with surprising precision, and added a new entry. The village remained asleep, unaware that beneath the floorboards of the poorest man in the harbor, a blueprint for a different life was being drawn. Night after night, in complete silence. The sun had barely begun to bleed over the horizon when Carlos hauled his catch toward the main street. He carried the fish by the gills, the scales still glistening with fresh brine. He stopped at the first restaurant, a place that thrived on the morning rush. He stepped into the back alley, the scent of stale grease and roasted coffee hanging heavy in the damp air. He held the fish out, steady-handed, and named a price reflective of the market data he had tracked for years. The restaurant owner did not look at the fish. He looked at Carlos, then shook his head with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He shoved a handful of coins toward him, a fraction of what the market demanded. It was the standard rate, the price for a man who had no leverage. Carlos did not reach for the money. He pulled the fish back, his grip tightening. He did not argue. Words were useless against a wall of habit. He turned his back on the kitchen door, the weight of the catch suddenly feeling twice as heavy. He walked toward the next building, his pace measured, but the rejection burned in the silence of the street. He had played the numbers, but the world was not yet ready to change its mind. He stood before the next door and knocked. He moved from door to door. The rejection was identical at every stop. The owner saw a man from the docks and calculated his value before he even spoke. By the time he reached the fifth restaurant, the skin on his heels had split, leaving a trail of wet, red marks on the pavement. He stopped. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the basket and stared at the peeling paint of the back entrance. A young woman stepped out, wiping her hands on a cloth. She looked at the fish, then at the man standing in the alley. She did not sneer. She reached out, felt the firmness of the catch, and nodded. She offered the price he demanded without a single word of negotiation. The exchange of money was brief, but the sound of the coins landing in his palm changed the gravity of his world. He walked away, his stride different now. He did not go home to rest. He went straight to the supply shop at the edge of the harbor. He laid the profit on the counter and pointed to a net made of finer, stronger twine. He had spent years catching scraps. Now, he was buying the tools to catch a future. He walked back to the docks, the weight of the new net heavy and promising in his hands. The rhythm of the sea remained, but the nature of his work shifted. With his second net came a second boat, and with that boat, a partner, a local man who understood the currents but lacked the drive. Carlos taught him the technique, then spent his own hours in the harbor, talking to suppliers and wholesalers. He no longer spent his entire day at sea. Instead, he stood on the docks, his notebook open, tracking the fluctuating prices of the market against the volume of his catch. He learned that buying in bulk reduced costs, and coordinating with other fishers increased their collective bargaining power. He reinvested every margin. When one boat became 2, he managed the schedules. When 2 became 4, he established a central point for distribution. The physical toll was constant, but it was no longer just about survival. He spent nights mapping out logistics, his fingers tracing lines of supply on the paper until they were stained with ink. Every year brought a new challenge: a damaged hull, a storm that destroyed a season of work, or a competitor who tried to undercut his price. He met each with the same steady, relentless focus. He was building a machine, one piece at a time, until the harbor was no longer just a place to dock, but the center of his own enterprise. The harbor had become a forest of masts, all bearing his mark. 20 vessels bobbed in the tide, their decks loaded with the day's haul, yet the silence on the dock was deeper than it had ever been. Carlos stood on the pier, his gaze shifting from the horizon to the ledger in his hand. He was no longer the man who pulled the oars. He was the man who ensured that 20 crews had work, that 20 vessels remained seaworthy, and that the market did not collapse under the weight of his own supply. Every creak of a hull felt like a demand on his time. Every delay in the supply chain was a knot in his own stomach. He walked to his flagship, the largest of the fleet, and climbed the ladder to the bridge. He looked down at the expanse of his enterprise, but there was no relief in the view. The pressure was a physical weight, a constant, dull ache behind his eyes that never faded. He checked the tide charts, then the distribution manifests, then the repair schedules. He was the architect of a system that demanded constant vigilance. The townspeople saw the boats and the profit, but they did not see the nights he spent awake, calculating the cost of a single failure. He stood at the helm, his hands tight against the wood, bracing for the inevitable day the world would finally notice what he had spent a lifetime building. The rumors moved faster than the tide. By sunrise, the docks were crowded with people who had ignored Carlos for years. They walked the perimeter of his fleet, running their fingers along the hulls of his ships as if searching for a secret mechanism. A merchant pushed through the crowd, stopping directly in front of Carlos on the deck of the flagship. The man gestured toward the horizon, his face twisted in a mix of curiosity and resentment. "It is incredible," the merchant said, his voice rising to be heard over the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "One day you were a ghost on the water, and now you own the harbor. How did you become so successful so quickly?" The crowd fell silent, waiting for a confession of a hidden discovery or a windfall of fortune. They saw only the finished result, the polished wood and the overflowing nets. They did not see the decades of salt, the exhaustion, or the isolation. Carlos looked at the man, then out at the water. He felt the weight of the moment, the sharp, stinging irony of being asked for the shortcut when he had walked the longest path imaginable. He did not blink. He did not smile. He simply stood, a statue of scarred hands and steady eyes, watching the people who believed that greatness was something that could happen overnight. The silence on the deck stretched until it became a physical barrier. Carlos did not move. He stood at the helm of the flagship, his boots planted firmly against the deck, eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had gathered to demand an explanation for his life. They shifted. They whispered. A few stepped closer, emboldened by his lack of response, their eyes darting toward his pockets as if searching for a hidden map or a ledger of illicit gains. They wanted a narrative of luck. They wanted a story of a single, lucky catch that turned the tide. Carlos watched them. He watched the way they leaned in, hungry for a shortcut they could replicate without the cost. He felt the cold breeze off the harbor, the same wind that had cut through him for 25 years. He tightened his grip on the railing, the wood biting into his palms. The air in the harbor felt stagnant, trapped by the weight of their assumptions. He finally let out a long, slow breath, a sound that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He looked at the merchant, then shifted his gaze to the horizon, his expression unreadable. He was ready to dismantle the myth they had built around him. He did not need to shout. He simply held their attention, forcing them to wait for the answer they were not prepared to hear. Carlos did not look at the merchant anymore. He reached out, his arms steady, and pointed a single finger toward the vast, dark stretch of water beyond the harbor wall. The crowd followed his gaze, their eyes scanning the empty, churning waves where no ships were anchored. He held his arm there, a rigid line against the sky, forcing them to look at the nothingness he had inhabited for 25 years. He waited until the murmurs died away, replaced by the rhythmic slap of water against the hulls. Then he brought his hand back. Opening his palm toward the front of the crowd, he turned his hands over, slowly, showing the thick, white ridges of scar tissue, the deep, dark calluses that had never fully healed, and the stiff, crooked knuckles. These were not the hands of a man who had found a shortcut. They were the hands of a man who had been broken and rebuilt by the tide. He held them out, a visual testament to the thousands of nights spent in the freezing spray, the bleeding palms, and the silent, agonizing labor that the village had never bothered to notice. The evidence was carved into his skin, a map of endurance that no one in the crowd could ever replicate. And as he let his hands drop, the weight of his reality finally settled over the deck. The crowd remained motionless. They looked at his hands, then at the horizon, and for the first time, they saw the cost behind the fleet. Carlos let his arms fall to his sides. He did not boast. He did not explain the mechanics of his trade. He looked at the merchant and said, "It took 25 years to build the person who could survive the success." He did not look for their approval. He did not seek their praise. He turned away from the railing and walked toward the cabin of his ship. The silence he left behind was not empty anymore. It was heavy with the realization that they had been measuring his life by the wrong scale. They had been looking at the boats, the profits, and the status, while he had been focused on the integrity of the work itself. He stepped into the shadows of the deck, leaving the harbor to the sound of the tide. The villagers watched him go, finally understanding that the man they saw was not a product of luck, but the result of a quarter-century of relentless, invisible friction against the sea. He had not just built an empire, he had built a foundation of bone and grit that could carry the weight of everything he had achieved.